I am Jeffrey McDaniels, Executive Director and Chief Instructor at ASCM Trainer. Welcome to our February 2024 educational webinar. We offer APICS and ISM certifications and certificate courses to companies and professionals and provide supply chain management learning that sticks. So, let's get started with this month's educational webinar. Thank you very much, David.
Okay. Very
It's
good.
yours.
Happy to. All right. Well, welcome everybody. And just a little bit of a housekeeping point. We're a small group. Please don't feel that you need to mute yourselves unless you got a lot of background noise. And please jump in anytime with a comment, a question, an issue. Okay. Yeah, we're going to save time at the end for some general discussion, but don't don't hesitate. Okay. I'd like to have this as much more of a conversation, if you will, than a presentation. So with that, we can move into the actual deck, if you will. So we already talked about who we are, and thanks for sharing. So what I have in mind here is I'm going to give a little bit of a background and scoping, because we talked about who we are. I guess part of that is to give you an idea of why perhaps we're worth dialoguing with or listening to, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about why there's validity, or why you may grant credibility to the ASCM Top 10 Trends study. So a bit on the process of how that was developed, and then we'll jump right into what these top 10 trends are, how they differ from 2023, and then we'll talk a wee bit of detail about each one so that we understand how APICS, ASCM, if you will, defines the terms, right? There's a lot of overlap between digitization, if you will, or digitalization, AI and machine learning and things of that nature. So we'll just do a bit of detail enough that we can make the terminology crisp. And then we'll just have some discussion. So with no further ado, latent clicking going on here. There we go. This is the process. So I was contacted by ASCM to be asked if I would join the subcommittee to help put this together. That would be the team building. They wanted a diverse team, and I'll show a map again in a short time to highlight the diversity of the team. Very diverse from industries as well as academic. And we had more service industry participants. If we talk about utilities and things like that, we had more participation with those team members this year than prior years, from what I was told. Then we went through a process of identifying the research resources, because we wanted those again to have a level of credibility and verification. And then we broke into teams of two. Right, we started out with about 35 people. We broke into teams of two. We were each assigned a series of topics and recommended resources, but we were also asked to provide our own list of resources we felt relevant to the topics we were asked to examine. Once that was done, it was all consolidated. There was a voting, if you will, activity that went on at the individual level. And then the consolidated scores brought out, based on likelihood and impact, what were the top 10. So it was a rigorous process. We started in January. We wrapped up our work in September. So this is not opinion by Toma. All right, this is really something where we were instructed to try and identify what we felt were major trends that would impact or shape supply chains. Currently, yes, but about 3 years out was the horizon we were asked to look to. So I mentioned a diverse team. I'll just show this briefly. You can read, 5 continents involved, 35 different people. So a good representation, good cross-section, and a good cross-functional team to work with, I have to say. This is just a snip of what we were given as a worksheet to prepare from and to comment on. But what is important here, again, just from a validity point of view, we gathered 419 unique pieces of literature from 200, well, more than 200 unique sources. And of course, duplication was normalized out. So for those of us involved in research, this might speak, to something. From a consolidation and voting point of view, you can see on the right, it was basically, a very simple, almost like a risk register approach where we took likelihood and impact and came up with an integer. The only thing we did beyond that was also categorize where we felt it fell in the score definitions, whether it be plan, source, make, so on and so forth. So we had a ranking that was, each of us, 35 individuals, not teams, did the ranking, and then this was all consolidated at Chicago. One of the things to show, and I'll show it briefly because it's an eye chart, is that if we did a regression analysis, we can see that the item in blue, digital supply chain, for example, and the areas beneath it, one of the things we can draw from that is there was a high level of agreement between the participants if we were looking at things that scored that far to the upper right. So we can see the top 4, top 5, the team, regardless of background, regardless of industry, had a high degree of agreement as far as the ranking. So I know I'm going a little quickly. Please jump out if you got any questions or comments. Let me know, please. So with no further ado, here's what the top 10 trends are per ASCM, okay? And a little legend on the side there. If it's blue, it means it's gone up in score from 2023. If it's orange, it's dropped down. And if it's green, it's totally new. It didn't appear in the 2023 trends at all. Okay. And, from my perspective, if we take a look at the greens, 4 out of 10 for this year are brand new. And I think that says something about the, the volatile nature that everyone's experienced in supply chains in the past year. We tend to look to COVID, but COVID pandemic impacts were years ago now, right? And here we're seeing the rise of things that maybe we attributed to outcomes or reactions to the challenges of COVID. But we can see here that, this supply chain volatility, if you will, is here to stay. If we were to put it in my terms. Any questions, observations, any surprises for you as to what's on the list or what's not on the list? Okay. If not, then I'll just carry on. So let's take a peek at what ASCM does to define the terminology, if you will, of these trends so that we can put it in categorization. We don't all use the same language in our offices or factories, right? So if we look at digitization, what APICS is focusing here on is the act of taking analog or information that's stored in, SCADA systems or even logic controllers or what have you, and converting that information into a digital format, right? So that it can be used in some of the new technologies that are available to us, right? The idea of having digital inputs is key to being able to give proper background information and context to the application of some of these digital tools that are available to us. But, the old garbage in, garbage out statement is widely applied here. And I think what I like about this is it recognizes that in order to execute, in order to actually benefit from these tools, we need material, we need data in order to base them on. And we have a lot of resident data in our organizations that needs to be converted into a digital format. And quite frankly, that's a heavy lift for many organizations. The next one is big data, right? And here we're really looking at external, right? Whereas prior, we were talking about that data which we already have resident and making sure that we convert it into a digital format so it can be utilized. Well, now we're looking at the world at large when we talk about big data and analytics from an APICS point of view, right? So, applications such as standardized freight data exchange, and we can talk about freight from a disruption point of view, all the way up to and including route optimization and port planning, things of this nature. Applications in inventory, locational dispersion of our inventory within our networks of distribution, things of this nature. We're looking now to pulling in data from the larger world. Red Cross does a wonderful job of this in their tool when they pull in data from NOAA and other atmospheric or rather meteorological historical data to determine flood zones during particular storm surges, right? So that we don't locate safe havens in an area that's going to become flooded. So the idea that we can apply here to improve our performance is what we're talking about with big data. Of course, you can't go very far without talking about artificial intelligence. Right? I saw another piece just this morning before I logged on, a company I've worked with that is developing tools where they're videoing the actions of operator assembling a control panel. And they actually have templates built in that guide the operator when something, visually on the cameras doesn't look right. And that combining of artificial intelligence and applying it to the factory floor is one of the things that we look to first, right? The whole idea here is in that video AI tool I described, there's no coding that has to go on. Nobody has to program. It's basically click, turn the cameras on, right? 2, do the work, and then 3, apply the template. So there's no program expertise required. And if we take it a step further and they integrate it with their ERP based on, let's say, the standard time for a particular operation, right, it can actually adjust the work sequencing and the routings, if you will, to promote or provide a more accurate view of not only lead time or operation cycle time, but standard cost. Investment. And this is where I was really pleased to see this come on to the dashboard this year. And that is the recognition that, yes, there's investment in systems required, but likewise, and even more so, investment in people. Okay, the whole idea that supply chain applications, the market itself of supply chain applications is growing so quickly that it could reach more than 30 billion in 2026 is staggering, right? And if we looked at taking a 0.5% of that expenditure, well, that's not necessarily translating to expenditure on an individual basis, but actual cost centering, and applied it to good onboarding and skill enhancement and training of personnel, we probably would have a much better likelihood of leveraging it. I know that if you gave me a saw, I wouldn't immediately become a carpenter. And I think what we're seeing here is that these tools are exploding and they're available and everybody wants to see how they can apply them. Yet, one, we don't have good input data yet necessarily based on our own internal data. And 2, we may not have been able to bring along our internal talent development in pace with purchasing a software package, right? So not denigrating the systems, I just want to say that systems without talent probably won't yield success. Traceability. Anyone who's dealt with CSCP, whether it's from Jeffrey, Sarin, myself, or whomever, knows the 3 V's of supply chain, right? And gaining visibility is one of them. The technology we have now for track and trace is not only being demanded by our customers, but it's also more powerful than I've ever seen before. In pharmaceuticals, it used to be all we had was an indicator to see whether or not temperature had been breached either on the lower control limit or the upper control limit during a transit. Now we can actually dynamically read actual temperature of a pharmaceutical in transit with some of these systems. It's just not only where is it, but what condition it's in, right? So this type of visibility gives us great power from a supply chain point of view, and it's truly what enables things like control towers to function. So it's a massive leap forward here in this track, trace, and location intelligence that we have today. How nice it is to be able to be aware proactively of a potential delay at a port, for example, by combining it with other big data elements, or being able to correlate the conditions at sea with the potential for delay. And when I focus on ports, I really would be neglectful if I didn't say airports, right? Because a lot of freight is being moved through the air in reaction to choke points right now in the maritime logistics, but also just due to smaller lot procurement and kind of a just-in-time approach, if you will. There's a lot more air freight going on as we speak. We'll talk about that a little bit in the next slide about disruption. All right, so disruption and risk management, of course, being on the top 10. All right. Basically, with an extended supply chain, we are exposed to more risk, right? More variables in a problem, you know how it goes. I mean, case in point, last week it was announced by a company called Fract, who specializes in freight, that container shipments, ocean-going container shipments, were down almost 70% in January, 70. Okay, and that was due to the intersection of climate-related issues with drought in Panama, dropping the level of the Panama Canal, conditions in accessing the Suez Canal due to the Red Sea disruptions. So we got a geopolitical element there as well. You know, if we're just dealing regionally, we probably are less exposed to such things, but many of us are dealing in global and extended supply chains, hence the exposure. And it keeps us on our toes. All right, there's nothing that we can do to change the external environment. We can change the extent to which we participate in it, right? We can pick our environment. Once we've done so, we've got to remain nimble and agile, even though it's so cliche these days, right? The idea that we have to be able to proactively manage the risk we're exposed to the best of our extent, yet to also have in place contingent and mitigation activities for when things don't go as planned. Right? We can plan and plan effectively for risk, but we cannot plan risk to zero. Okay. Somebody once said a ship at port is perfectly safe, but that's not what a ship is built for, right? Cybersecurity. We've got some great stuff going on right here in Maryland right now, talking not about IT security, but OT security, right? Operational technology security. Excuse me. I have to edit that one out, Jeffrey. Right, because we're looking at interconnecting with all these tools, we're reducing what's considered or called in the industry the air gap between our entities. Whereas it used to be that standalone, if you will, SCADA-based functionality or programmable logic controller-based technology controlled and monitored our equipment. But now as we're connecting them together to gain, right, that machine learning benefit that we can leverage internally, we reduce that air gap. What does that mean? Well, that means if somebody can gain access perhaps to our company email, they can actually touch directly the production line. Okay. And we can say, well, what bad actor would do such a thing? Well, there's an example, unfortunately, in the news in the past years where bad actors have actually gone in and hacked the ballast control valves in tankers that were at port, creating a capsized tanker, thereby blocking the harbor for use for an extended period of time, right? So this idea of cybersecurity is, of course, our information systems, but even more so nowadays, our operating systems, because we're so connected, everything is exposed. So I guess that's the downside of looking at having an extended enterprise, to use APICS definitions. Of course, sustainability, right? We just talked about drought conditions in Panama. How could we not talk about sustainability? But it made it to our top 10 trends as a major influencer for how supply chains are going to be designed, for how organizations are going to strategically position their supply chains to meet some of these, rather aggressive but very necessary goals for zero emission, zero waste, things of this nature. Okay. Unfortunately, in retrospect, when we look at disruptions like I just mentioned regarding the Panama and Suez canals, these tankers are now taking a route around the Cape of Good Hope, which means they're burning more fuel, creating more emissions, and of course, taking more time and creating more cost. So what I think we need to do, and what APICS is talking about here, is that as we design our supply chain strategies, we need to design them with sustainability impacts in mind. Okay. And look at not only ourselves, but look at the behavior of our suppliers and our suppliers' suppliers in that design consideration. Because if we don't do it voluntarily, quite frankly, it will be regulated, right? Just like electronic waste was regulated. And then last, but certainly not least, the geopolitical and the deglobalization that the geopolitical challenges have offered to supply chains. There's been a groundswell of, if you will, resourcing, near sourcing, the one I like the best, friend sourcing, but basically this idea of regionalizing supply chains to the extent it's possible to reduce the exposure, right? The exposure that we can't plan away to zero, but to minimize its impact or at least its magnitude upon an organization. Of course, how we react to it and how we deal with it when it goes wrong, that's the resilience quotient. Right? But the idea that this, due to conflicts in the Ukraine, a lot of food supply chain disruption has gone on there that hasn't made front page news. Things of this nature, when we look at those disruptions in the South China Sea and the geopolitical tensions that are on the rise, not on the decline, not to mention this is a year of mega elections, right? Mexico is getting a new president. We will get a new president. I think there are 27 or 29 countries in this coming election year that will have new heads of state. Okay, so with all of that geopolitical, if you will, question in the air, we do have to consider, how exposed our supply chain designs are to those impacts and look at how we might put mitigation factors in place or contingent programs in place. The challenge for supply chain professionals like you and I is the fact that with inflationary pressures and the rising cost of logistics, we're being pressured to reduce cost, right? Because it's starting to eat into margin, okay? When in fact, some of our redundancy recommendations and some of our alternate strategies may in fact not improve a cost position, may add cost. So we're really in a tough spot here in the supply chain profession where we're being tasked to deliver economic worth, if you will, but at the same time protect our organizations from disruption and risk and passing that on to our end users. So never a dull moment in supply chain, and never more so than as we speak. So that rounds out the top 10, if you will, that ASCM talked about. And now I'd just like to be quiet for a moment, just because you're nice people and you deserve it, but also to give you a chance to comment, question. I'm curious, anything here that surprises you, anything that's not here that you would have thought should be here, and can you see any relevance? But at this point, I'm going to ask Jeffrey to take the con, and I'll just listen.
just go ahead and unmute yourself and speak, or you can put it in the chat, of course. But small group, just go ahead and ask your question.
Well, it seemed like we were kind of on the road to recovery with materials flowing in. And then I'm getting now, like, stuff was turned away at the port.
Mm,
You know, I was quoted a 10 to 12 week delivery, and now it's turned into 52 weeks.
yeah.
And, you know, in our industry, I can't really compare what other people do in manufacturing, but we keep the lights on and the water flowing. So, you know, it's really important, but it seems like we were kind of getting better lead times for a while. And now, like I said, I'm hearing all this stuff about stuff coming from China is getting like got rejected at the port or whatever, you know, and it's really kind of putting us in a spot to try to find alternative, you know, alternative product, be willing to, you know, look at substitutions, things like that. Of course, we have to run all this through engineers, you know, but we're seeing a lot more of our distributors are sending us things like that. So that's kind of where, like you said, it's everyday challenge, you know, something's popping up every single day with,
Yeah.
especially with materials not flowing. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen, never mind the additional, 3 weeks or so going around the Cape of Good Hope adds to a standard route. We've seen for ages now, since the Long Beach strikes, if you will, we've seen for ages now this whole idea of lead times not just doubling but quadrupling. We we've had occasions where lead times that used to be 8 to 12 weeks have gone in excess of 26 weeks, and literally overnight, right? And the worst part is, to your point, Paul, is sometimes you don't find out until it's already happened to you, right?
Right, we're
We've,
following up, going, hey, where's our stuff? And our supplier,
mm,
we'll get right back to you. Oh, that's been
mm-hmm,
bumped out. You've
exactly.
got projects ready to start, and you're like, oh, what do I tell these guys? Like, you're
Mm-hmm,
not gonna be here.
right.
Hey, Paula, just for clarification, is the problem in the outbound port or the inbound port? Is it
I-
is it the
From
U.S. port or that's causing the problem, or the
from what
other
I
way?
was told, it was inbound,
Mm-hmm. That's what
like
I've
they
been
were
hearing.
rejected inbound, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
not sure why.
Any clarification as to why?
No, they don't, they just said it was rejected and they had to return it and it's coming back is what I've been told. And I'm like, and it's coming from China. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I know things there have been volatile.
Truly.
You got the world issues going on, but it's definitely causing major issues because sometimes then you're gonna end up paying a higher price, right?
Right.
Might be
Right.
able to find that substitute, but you know, it's double the price of what you did order that would work, that there's nothing wrong with. But you know, you're just kind of, they got you
Mm-hmm.
pretty much wrapped up with how you're gonna have to react to some of this stuff.
Maybe I don't. I'm not up to date here, but before, to ship an item to the U.S., you had to get pre-clearance so many days ahead of time, and then before it hits the port, it has to be rebroadcasted to customs for approval. It seems to me something is not working right, or the information you're getting is not correct.
Well, it could be something
Um,
as simple as letter of credit violation if that's being used. I mean, what we're seeing with some of my clients is that because shipments are becoming so delayed,
mhm.
if they don't amend or re-raise their letter of credit in time, then they're outside of date range by the time it actually comes in for clearance. And so I've seen that
Wow.
as one example. Okay, I'm not saying that's what this is, but it can be a myriad of things. But Paula makes a key point here. We talk about how we might reduce our exposure to risk, maybe by regionalization or things of that nature. But what's a person to do when their primary materials are only available from a single source? Right now, what do you do? Right, and never
We have a
mind
lot of that.
Yeah, exactly. And never mind the cost, right? Just availability.
It doesn't matter what it costs, you got to get it.
That's right.
You know,
Right.
especially transformers.
Mm-hmm.
That has been, we've seen transformers that cost $2,000 now cost $24,000.
Sure.
Just a little green box in front of your house.
Mm-hmm.
You know? And it's just ridiculous, but it's always a challenge.
Yeah. I think that, we can say one of the reasons why visibility is ranked so highly in the top 10 trends is just what we're talking about, Paul. And not only is it the damage that a breakage in the supply chain gives you, but it's the fact that you don't find out about it until it's too late to do anything about it, right?
Absolutely.
So yes, very frustrating. I've been there.
Feel like I'm staying behind the power curve all the time instead of in front of it.
Sounds like to me you need to do, in addition to this particular situation or situations, you need to look at the overall sourcing philosophy you're using. And like David indicated in a couple of his comments, find some alternatives, because it sounds like this disruption, if you do nothing to it, may not fix itself.
Mm-mm.
Yeah, and that's what we're doing. And sometimes it's unfortunate when you're in the government sector, you have a lot of rules and regulations that you don't have out there in the commercial world as far as procurement goes.
Mm.
They turned over all the inventory buying to me under the formal threshold back in May. So I've gotten my taste of, I'm always sending the engineers a substitute. I tell all my suppliers, if you can't get this, find me something else.
Mm-hmm.
Offer me something else, because we just can't run out of material. It's not an option here.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not, they will not listen to that excuse. So, but there's very limited people, in the US that manufacture and make what we buy. That's part of the issue too.
Right. Right. Yeah,
That's
yes.
part of the issue. So.
Yeah, yourselves and anyone who deals in consumer electronics are in the same boat. Yes, exactly.
The reason I bring that up, and David posted a posting on LinkedIn about this about a week or two ago, is that a lot of people identify a problem like this and they do nothing about it. They just kind of put up with it, when in fact it takes a year or so to change your supply chain from single source to multiple source and all those things. They never seem to get onto that. They never seem to start the action. And typically it's delayed. And in fact, the problems you have today are the same problems you're going to have next year, if not at a higher level. Anyway, good question.
Yeah, there's a lot of the devil we know mentality out there. And I can understand it, right? It's already disrupted. Do you want to self-disrupt it even further still? But, unfortunately, sometimes that's the only way to heal. So, yeah. Who else?
So what is our company is really starting to focus a lot on AI as a whole within supply chain. So quite frankly, I kind of laugh about it because I remember back in the day when you would hear your parents say, "Oh, I'm too old to learn something new," right? So I'm starting to get that anxious feeling of myself, right? Thinking the same thing, how am I going to embrace this as a supply chain specialist? So really understand the value for it, especially in the manufacturing world.
Right.
But what are your thoughts on when you're actually sitting more at a corporate role on how that can benefit you in the supply chain, and especially around risk mitigation?
Jeffrey?
Yeah, the whole technology side of this, and David and I have had some direct conversations between the two of us about this. Companies do you go this route with technology, and how do you justify it on a return on investment? And typically, your investment is a long-term investment. It's not something that you can get a benefit this year from if you implement it. So that's one issue. Secondly, it typically takes a leadership in the company who are more mid and long term to realize the benefits of doing this. Because you're not getting a short-term gain at all. Most leaders in companies, it seems to be from surveys, are more focused on the short term, day to day, making the numbers, keeping the stock price up and all this other stuff. And when they do that, they don't do anything as far as technology changes until it's too late. And the same holds true with the example that Paul had. They just don't want to spend the money because it takes their expenses up and their profits down. Now, to answer the question about how did all this, to get a better understanding of how all this fits and the effect that it has on cybersecurity and all, that's good questions. We have a course that I just finished, the one on the supply chain technology course that gives a very good understanding of this, as well as the resilience course in the supply chain really helps, those certificates. And that will show you how they all fit together, but they all do. The more you go into, and David was talking about this, and I'm sure he's going to pick up on this, the more you talk about integrating technologies and all, the higher the risk becomes, potential risk from cyber. So it has to be a balanced approach of all of that. And you really have to do that. If you don't, you could incur some issues.
Yeah, I think that to kind of key off of that, there's another certificate program that for supply chain transformation, and Jeffrey and I were talking about the content of that program. And what I'll key in on is, even for those organizations that justify making a change economically, and they're few and far between, I have to say, they're few and far between, especially right now with inflationary pressures and the uncertainty of an election year. Most companies are sitting on their cash, right? So, but those who have been bold enough and courageous enough to make a commitment to investing in systems still fall down a bit on the investment in people. And I'll tell you why. If you think of something as basic as rolling out an ERP system and the impact it has on an organization, right? More than a year and usually twice the budget that was anticipated. If you take a look at some of these advanced tools we're talking about, if we don't focus on the change management aspect of deploying these programs, the failure rate exceeds 90%. Okay, less than of the 20% of the programs that do make it past the first year of deployment, right? Only half of them at best sustain beyond the first year. The rest decline in their use. And when you talk about throwing money away, you might see some jaded CEO that says, well, we tried this 2 years ago, and after we spent X millions of dollars and we had an initial improvement, that improvement went away before it could generate an ROI. So if we don't include the talent, the people, and the impact on the organizational design that these types of transformations bring with them, economical and technical challenge aside, if we don't bring our people along with us, we're not gonna realize a benefit. And that's what I like about the transformation materials. They do spend a lot of time talking about that. Go ahead, Jeffrey.
You brought up some percentages. Back before COVID, when you had a major application you put in, enterprise systems or distribution center systems or transportation systems, they had a return. How many of them achieved their return on investment of goal? In the first year or second year, turned out to be that less than 35% ever achieved it.
Oh, yeah.
And those are much less complicated systems. So you throw in these highfalutin systems and it's going to be even less. And everybody thinks, at least a lot of the leaders think, from my assessment of them, is that that will solve all their problems, putting money in the technology. I'm sorry, that's not true. It's understanding you can't use technology if you don't have core skills, if you don't have the key concepts and best practices that we teach and that are taught in certification classes, and people actually know, have the knowledge and able to implement them and actually do in the workplace, you're never going to get the return on the technology. And the technology is not replacing people; they're just providing better visibility and allowing you to analyze data that you couldn't see before to make decisions. So I am skeptical. I do not think the benefit will be there. So many people I talk to as an educator thinks that's all they need to do is technology.
Well, I think that's why a lot of companies are in stasis, because if they have a across the board mandatory needs to pay back in 24 months approach to any capital program, there's no way these technology programs pay back in 24 months. They've got a much longer cycle than that. And that could be what's keeping them off the decision table. That in and of itself, Jeffrey, I mean, I think it's a really good point. I mean, you know, we had an old saying when I used to work on the engineering side, was that automating a bad process only ensured that we could make a bad output more quickly, right? And
bigger.
And bigger. Yeah. So I think that applies even on the tech side, even though I'm not a tech guru. I think that applies on the tech side as well as the tangible output side. Go ahead, Jeffrey.
You know, I'm a project manager, and I have done 20,000 hours of projects and supply chain, not as a project manager, but as a functional manager who was given the extra responsibility. And the ones for technology never, ever, unless you really manage it, ever achieve their ROI. I was fortunate because the key with ROI is a lot of them, but one is the stakeholders, making sure that you have realistic objectives and realistic ROI, and then you go out and achieve those, and you hold people accountable. And in most cases that I've seen where I've either been a team member, not the lead, but the team member or an outsider, executives a lot of time will let a project in, even though it hasn't fulfilled its responsibility, and they don't manage it very well. And every one of my projects in which I've been a project manager, from technologies to facilities, have always met the objectives because we did it the right way. We did it the best practice way. And it was not start a project and then we'll come back to you in a year and tell you about it. It's a weekly or it's a communication plan. It's a lot of different things. But going back to your question, it's going to have major effect on Cypher if, in fact, IT is not part of the project of making sure that all of this happens together. It has to happen together. It's an integrated. Anything that's a application, IT needs to make sure it fits the perfect fit within the umbrella of technologies, and that it gives us all the things gives us protection from the potential risk. And they're a huge risk, as you know. Well, Dave, you got about 3 minutes left. I don't know any more questions.
I don't know if Irene wanted to make a comment.
Well, just one more. Caller, I don't know if we really answered your question. We gave you some points.
It's all good. I think there's just so much coming out of it right now, right? That it just is, I think it's more or less, probably goes back to more of the change management and the communication, right? Yeah. So really it's more or less, understanding the value in different areas versus just the whole value itself.
Y'all know I came from Apple, and one thing we do there quite well, we never buy version 1 of any application. Any new technology, we wait for 2 years before we ever use it. Doesn't mean we don't play around with it and see if it's possible to do what we want it to do. But we wait until it's version 2.3 before we buy it. And then we make sure we have a business case. And in this case, because of the technology side of it, and because it's at a strategic level, it's a business case study that we do to make sure it fits and will give us what we want. We don't spend money and throw it away. I can assure you that. Okay, so I don't know many companies that are able to do that. I know some companies that want to do that, but they just don't have the cash or time
or the leadership quotient. Yeah,
yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know if we got a few minutes left. Irene, did you want to chime in with anything? Observation, question?
No questions. Everything you've talked about and presented on makes sense to me. And I think a lot of the top 10 are all connected.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a big Venn diagram, and to get to that more perfect state, can't address just one.
Yeah.
And I know, like, where I came from, that all of these were issues, and we were always like jumping. I think one of the big things was parts obsolescence, and learning about it. I feel like we were always the last to know that something was no longer being manufactured. And I thought, I don't know how that ties into supply chain, but it was what kept us scrambling all the time. And I think it all ties into all these other, these top 10. It's big data, it's investing, it's connecting. This all makes really good sense.
Yeah, in the consumer world, retail teaches us a lot. In that if we take a look at our own daily behaviors, we get push notifications anytime something is being shipped by Amazon, right? Your order's been received. Oh, your order is on its way. Oh, your order is at such and such a point. And if we had that type of visibility or transparent communication between our suppliers and ourselves, then we wouldn't be caught short so often as you described, right? Because it is endemic, Irene. Finding out because you inquire instead of being proactively informed by your supply network is endemic, and it creates great waste. Right? I won't call it pain. Let's just focus on the waste of energy, the waste of money, the waste of time, and none of it is value for the customers.
Yep, agree.
Yeah. Thank you.
Just one more comment before we close, and David can do the close here, if you will, in a minute. But these are trends. They're not the things that we typically see every day. So my concern is that so many middle managers that I know, as well as new people in the field, are trying to do things at such a strategic level. We have to do our jobs at the appropriate level we're in, and we really need to make sure we have knowledge of how to do it and do the best practices and all. And then, but stay aware of the trends because they will affect us. So don't get too focused on the trends. Personally, as a practitioner, I'm more focused on how do I get out of the situation I'm in now at work. The long lead times, the poor quality. I'm at Boeing. If I was a Boeing employee, I should be not concerned about the trends. I should be concerned about the quality. And now, what in my job can I do to make sure the quality gets better? So don't get too far into these trends. They're a good idea of what's going to affect you in the near term and long term, but they're not the things that solve our problems. So, David, we're about done. We're done.
I think that's a great way to wrap it. I mean, I appreciate your time and attention today. Of course, from my perspective, I appreciated being involved in this subcommittee work and being able to get input from so many different people with different backgrounds. And I was not that surprised at how much in agreement we all were. And I think this idea, trends for consideration now and the midterm, I think it's important if we want to consider where we might want to look at our own skill development suite of offerings that we bring to to our employer or just for our own edification, intellectual curiosity. I think that they give value there. And I think that some of them are self-evident, right? If we didn't realize there's an interconnectivity, as Irene mentioned, between climate, geopolitical, and general disruptions, and disruptions having an impact on how we look at sourcing and developing a supply chain, we'd be remiss. Visibility, increase your visibility, reduce your variability, and you're halfway or 2/3 of the way to a sound approach to the fundamentals required for supply chain, regardless of the tool you use, a legal pad or a quantum computer, right? Without those fundamentals, you're pretty much done before you start. And with that, I say thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you, everyone.
All right.
All the best. Be safe.
All the best. Yeah, connect up with us if you haven't.
I will. Thank you.
Okay, then bye for now.
Well, David,